Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's SANS webcast. You have to see the criminal to catch the criminal. The most relevant data to monitor ranked. Sponsored by CI Security. My name is Carol Auth of SANS, and I will be moderating today's webcast. Today's featured speakers are Mike Simon, CTO of CI Security, and Brandon McCrillis, SANS Analyst and SANS Certified Instructor. If during the webcast you have any questions for our presenters, please enter them into the questions window located on the GoToWebinar interface at any time. Please note that this webcast is being recorded, and a copy of the slides and recording of this webcast will be available for viewing later today and can be found on the SANS registration page. And with that, I'd like to hand the webcast over to Brandon.
Thank you very much, Carol. I'm Brandon McCrillis, happy to be here today with Mike Simon from CI Security, discussing an extraordinarily wonderful topic that could take us far more than just 1 hour can fit in. Have some agenda today. We want to discuss the most relevant data to monitor, and of course, why. Why do you want to look at these data sources? Why do you want to retain these? For how long do you want to retain these? We're also going to discuss a couple real-world incident response examples that I've encountered, just to enforce the value of retaining that most relevant data. You'll see I have a quote from Mike Simon actually in my presentation, which is great, talking about you never want to be looking for that data source and finding that you just don't have it because of some sort of gap in your visibility or just because of your configurations. We're going to give you some tips for ranking those data types. Logging, almost every device now creates logs, and not just one log, tons and tons of logs. Storage usually is a finite amount, depending on your information security budget. Maybe some of you out there are slinging it with some nice hardware. But for most of us, we have to really concentrate on how much data we are retaining for how long, and where are we going to store all this stuff, and then how are we going to access it when needed. And then we'll provide some closing thoughts on this subject. So I teach the Security Sec 60 penetration class at SANS, and I wanted to talk about, as I was writing this webcast today, what am I worried about as an attacker? What are the things that I, the attacker, am worried about when I am trying to go low and slow inside a network? Of course, security logs, successful and unsuccessful authentication attempts. As an attacker, I know I'm going to log somewhere, but security logs, especially the successful and unsuccessful authentication attempts, you would think that's kind of common sense to log these things. We find, and I'll explain later, a lot of organizations aren't. Something as simple as logging those unsuccessful authentication attempts, how are you alerting yourself to brute force activity or password guessing that's happening within that environment? Network monitoring. Network monitoring is always scary because you never know if someone's doing NetFlow capture. I'll mention later, I'd love it if everyone could do full take packet capture on the edge and retain for 90 days, but that all goes back to efficiency and where am I going to put all this stuff. But in a target environment, if there's any kind of network security monitoring going on, I'm cognizant of that. I want to be cognizant of what kind of traffic I'm putting on the wire. I don't want to get caught prematurely. I want to stay there. I want to pivot. I want to expand my presence within that network. I want to find your crown jewels, right? Security alerting. So just because, as I said, I'm already logging. As an attacker, I know I'm going to create logs. It's just going to happen. I want to create logs in a minimal type of sense. And again, I don't want to create multiple logs that are going to alert to my behavior. It's important that is there actually security logging happening, right? Security alerting, excuse me. So just because I'm logging, who's looking at it on the other end? Chances are nobody, or maybe you're doing that in a batch cycle. Someone's reviewing them weekly or monthly. Maybe you're feeding that into a SIM, but then I'd ask what data sources are being fed into that SIM, and we'll discuss all of that in just a little bit. Of course, intrusion detection, yeah, it comes kind of hand in hand with network monitoring, but what I'm talking about here is not just my traffic, my packets on the wire being recorded by some sort of network security monitoring appliance or packet capture device. I'm worried about you correlating that with some sort of rule, right? Matching my malicious traffic with IDS rules, whether on the network level and then even worse on the host level. It says there, creating host-based artifacts. That kind of goes hand in hand with HIDs. If you have a host-based intrusion detection system at that endpoint, it can make my job a lot harder. Any kind of security technology that's on that endpoint that can look at files that are created on that disk and actions that are happening on that workstation can potentially cause me a bad time. Antivirus doesn't necessarily stop me. It depends on the product and the configuration, of course. But I'll give you an example. McAfee. In McAfee environments, we're able to leverage that McAfee whitelists a process WinLogon. If you inject your malicious payload into WinLogon all day long, I can kind of pivot around perhaps. Or maybe I can push some VBS script through McAfee. Maybe if you have an e-policy orchestrator, an EPO server in that environment, maybe I can compromise that and start pushing malicious VB script from your McAfee EPO server. Be some pretty evil stuff. And then, of course, my exfiltration ability. How am I going to get that crown jewel data? How am I going to get that sensitive data out of that environment? This kind of goes hand in hand with a reliable connection. I don't want to be an underprivileged user necessarily. I don't want to have very shady comms. I want to have good exfiltration ability in and outside of your network so I can get tools on target and then also get that wonderful data that I'm trying to steal from you out. So taking a look at the CIS top 20. So some of you hopefully are saying, wait a minute, CSC 14, that's not maintenance monitoring and analysis of audit logs, but it used to be. In 2014, if you go back and look at our critical security controls back then, maintenance monitoring and analysis of audit logs was number 14 on that list. If you look at it now in the updated version, as these threats have evolved and we've done more information security wonderfulness in the industry, we see that this is now critical security control number 6. It's very, very important. I tell organizations that I deal with, if you're looking at the SANS and CIS critical security controls, start with those top 5. Give me demonstration of those top 5 that they are good to go. But then once you want to increase maturity, maintenance, monitoring, and analysis of these audit logs have to happen. You have to collect these things. You have to manage these things. The big takeaway here is analyze. Someone has to look at this stuff. So what do you gain when you retain? As you know by now, logs are great, but how long are we going to keep these things? What if I'm under some sort of regulatory compliance, right? I have fixed data, fixed numbers of data, maybe fixed data sets that I have to retain. We think of PCI standards here. We think of HIPAA compliance standards. What other kind of regulatory compliance standards you're under? You might have to be forced to retain this stuff, even though it's not useful to an incident response or some sort of response to an event. Of course, retaining these logs, that facilitates effective incident response. When you're fighting the dumpster fires, you want to have those logging sources. You want to be able to pull on that yarn and untangle that whole beast. We do that through logging, correlating these events that happen distributed across your environment. Historical security metrics. That could be another reason why you want to retain logs for longer, right? I can see what's working. I can understand where is my information security budget being applied and really how much value, how much return on that initial investment am I getting? Baseline activities. If you have those logs, we can then begin to develop a baseline of what's good in that environment. How do you know what's bad, right? You have to understand your baseline, look at that traffic, look at that logging activity, understand processes and actions that users take, events, right, within that environment. And then maybe retaining logs helps you with network efficiency. Maybe that next greenfield event or that next rollout of new technology, you can kind of look at some of those logs, how you're retaining those logs, how you're storing those logs, usefulness of those logs, and then also maybe be examining, what kind of log output will that new piece of technology provide me? It's one thing to integrate new technology into your environment that will meet some sort of critical business need. Yes, that's great. But is that going to be less or more logging or more complicated logging or more granular logging than maybe what you currently have? All things to consider. Data gluttony. See this a lot. Common misconception is log all the things. I see many environments where, hey, if it can create a log, we want to keep it, and we want to keep it as long as we can. We find a lot of times that sometimes as long as we can is 59 minutes. Sometimes as long as we can is a day or so. But don't log all the things. You want to ask some questions here. Does that log source provide relevant and actionable data for me? Can I write detection rules around what is in that log? How much of this logging source or data source can I store? For how long, right? Again, you have to look at what is the value of that data source. Maybe logs from one security technology are more valuable to keep for 30 days, whereas your domain controller logs, I want to keep those longer, maybe to meet compliance or some other kind of standards, or just to be good practice. What's the ease of centralized ingestion? So a lot of us have a SIM or some sort of centralized log management solution inside our enterprise environments, but it doesn't mean that that technology can ingest every type of log. We think of homegrown technologies, new technologies, Internet of Things technologies. How are you going to get the log, even though device X creates that log? How are you going to get that thing ingested into that centralized logging solution? How much can I trust this data source? Sometimes I get some questions about this. Timestamps can be misleading. Depending on that logging source and the network perspective of that logging source, you might have some skews in how it's logging or how it's even recording timestamps. You have some interesting logs that might show activities that someone took interactively on that system, but the timestamps don't correlate correctly to the rest of that system. We see some interesting things there. So how much can I trust this data source also goes in there, and that all rolls back to question number one to ask, does this provide relevant and actionable data for me? If you don't trust it, it's probably not relevant. But if it does have some data that's actionable or that you can write those detection rules around, you might be reconsidering that. So as I said, who is actually going to look at this? Right? We have a quote from Jake Williams here. The paper is referenced below as another SANS Analyst paper. A security control logging alerts that no one ever reviews provides little value to the organization. In fact, it may actually weaken security by creating a false sense of security. Absolutely 100% agree with this. If you are logging that thing, you might say, okay, I'm going to sleep well tonight because I know this new technology in my environment is producing logs. But again, if you're not considering how long I'm keeping those logs, how useful are those logs, then you're creating that false sense of security. In general, most attackers, we don't want to get noticed. I say most attackers because if you're an attacker that's deploying ransomware, you're going to get noticed. You're going to get noticed. It's just the point of the game. However, more advanced attackers don't want to get noticed in general. Start with the basics in your environment. Start with that basic logging. Start with that basic maturity and implement more advanced logging and detection maturity as that program grows. You want to accommodate retention of that most critical source first. After you go through and you rank and you say, all right, domain controller security logs, that should be high on your list. I want to keep those. I want to have those available to me. And I want to make sure that, if I'm able, I have at least 90 days. I would love to have 90 days of DC logs all the time in every environment. Worst case scenario, I think 30 days is probably a good baseline if you're not having some sort of different compliance rules there. We want to make it painful for that attacker, but not painful for our team. Right? We want to make it painful. We want to have these detection rules. We want these devices logging the appropriate things for us. We want those ingested into some sort of single pane of glass if we have centralized logging in our environment. And we want to cause pain for that attacker. But I don't want it painful for my team to even set this kind of stuff up. Right? If it takes me hundreds and thousands of man hours to write one detection rule over one event, right? I really have to understand, is there a better way to do this? Right? Is this too painful for my team? Understand that. How much pain for my team versus how painful would this be for the attacker might help you make some of those quick decisions. Because we can't analyze what we don't log, consider enabling detailed process tracking on Windows and process accounting on Linux. This is great for a lot of reasons that I'll talk about just a little bit. Yes, this could create a lot of logs, but it all goes back to kind of the baseline standards that you want to kind of keep in mind. Threat hunting and security control audits. I can't do a webcast without talking about threat hunting. Incredibly valuable, right? And those secondary security control audits. Okay, so that firewall or that intrusion detection system is doing what it says it's going to do, right? Have another independent review of that. Do another audit from another team or someone else on that team that doesn't maybe look at that appliance all the time. It just helps you keep your program on track and always trying to shoot higher and keep maturing. Validate those information security investments, the people, the process, the technologies that you're putting in place. Threat hunting and those secondary audits really validate those investments. So what about threat intelligence? Just because it's out there doesn't mean it's a threat to my organization. I get this, I remember a healthcare organization years ago. They said, we're scared about Stuxnet. And I said, well, are you doing any like power generation? You have an industrial control system back here? Like what's going on, right? You're running some nuke plants? And it was, well, it's in the news, right? Just because it's in the news doesn't mean it's a threat to your organization. Threat intelligence helps us here. What I'm saying here is concentrate on threats that are relevant to your market vertical. Understand those indicators of compromise from those specific events that are targeting your market vertical or your organization. Start maturing your program based upon those things. You know that's going to happen, right? If I'm a managed service provider and I know that there's a ransomware variant out there right now that is targeting me to encrypt not only me, but all of the clients I serve, right? I want to make sure that I'm writing detection rules in my own environment around that kind of outbreak. If I'm a healthcare organization, then maybe this specific variant of ransomware I'm not worried about because it targets MSPs. However, think of the healthcare targeting variants that are out there. Just one example for you. But the big thing is know trends in your business and market vertical, know the prevalent attacks, know the methodologies and the groups that are looking at you saying, wow, this is a juicy target. Understand that for your business and specific market vertical. Spend time understanding that threat landscape. Understand who's after you, who's hunting you, who wants to kill on your ground, right? Understand this stuff. It really helps you develop an effective defense strategy. Utilize that internal threat intelligence source that you may have. They're free, folks. Web logs, right? DMZ logs, firewall logs, right? Understand who is scanning you, what kind of countries are scanning you. What IP addresses and maybe what actors is that associated to, or what malware campaigns are those associated to that's knocking at the front door on your web server, right? These things are generating logs. Use those as an internal threat intelligence resource if you're worried about budget. You can also get paid feeds and that sort of thing as well. In closing here on this slide, there's a lot of information out there and many rabbit holes you can go down. Start simple and procure a feed that's digestible to you, that's understandable to you, and provides the best return on that investment for the resource effort consumed. So where are your blind spots? Third-party hosting, see this all the time. Can you even get access to that logging data? Right? I'm hosting apps somewhere. I'm hosting an EHR platform in someone else's data center. How, am I allowed to get this data if I need it? How long are they retaining that data, that authentication log to that application? Things to consider. Hybrid infrastructure, lots of blind spots here. We see virtual private cloud, technologies, and then a very expansive on-prem infrastructure, and often you see that their security technologies and their security tuning is aligned just to maybe that on-prem environment, and they're really not looking in that hybrid cloud environment. Cloud environments also, right? If you're running a lot in the cloud, you have to, it's a little bit different to kind of do that monitoring. And also you have to keep in mind that you're paying for data. So if I'm sending logs out of that environment, or maybe I'm running scans within that environment, I have to be understanding what impact that's going to give me as far as my monthly subscriptions or data usage. Legacy systems. This should never, ever, ever, ever be a blind spot. If you have legacy systems, listen, folks, we all do. I did a ransomware, it was a malware outbreak in a healthcare organization. Long story short, it was installing a service called rpcss.exe. So we did some PowerShell plus WMI stuff, gave us a list of all the machines that had this malicious service involved. Client comes back and they say 3 of those are false positive. And I'm like, well, that's only false positive if that's a Windows NT box. And they said they are, right? And then after my mini heart attack and I check my watch and say, well, it's 2017, why do you have these NT4 machines? The client says they make $1 million a day each. Listen, folks, I'm never going to convince that board to go through a change configuration to upgrade those servers. So what we want to do is we have those legacy systems. The business has determined that it's an acceptable risk, right? $1 million a day. I'm never going to convince the board to unplug those for 24 hours. It's $1 million each. So we want to increase controls around there. We want to increase our monitoring around there. I want to list those systems. If I have multiple unsuccessful logins to those kinds of devices, I want all the bells and whistles and flags to alert on my SOC. I want the CISO to get a call at home, right? If something impacts one of those machines, because if something happens, if that thing gets popped, that's where the money is. Distributed applications kind of goes back to that hybrid infrastructure. If you're hosting specific business functional applications somewhere else, just understand what kind of logs are available. How are you going to get those logs? Can you even ingest those into your your SIM or other centralized logging solution. And then, of course, other business units or mergers. See this all the time. I've seen some interesting kind of merger situations where you have drastically different security technologies on both sides, and you find that it kind of silos the information security monitoring. We'll see one business unit or one former competing company that's been acquired and merged in, having completely different technology, completely different visibility, which also results in completely different blind spots. So understand that a lot of businesses grow through these mergers. Check this stuff out. Just because that other business doesn't use your technology, right? Try to understand this stuff and make things integrate. Common operating picture is the name of the game. So preparation is key. Know your infrastructure and technology. You want a baseline event generation and scale your instrumentation accordingly. Scale it accordingly. Think about this stuff. How am I going to, my organization is going to quadruple in a year, right? I don't want to set myself in, lock myself into some sort of SIM solution that's not going to scale with me. Ensure those critical business systems are integrated first. Again, folks, that's where the money is. That's where you want, that's what you want to protect. Ensure that you have good visibility over those critical business systems, that you have that specific asset at a higher criticality. If some sort of malicious event happens, right, you want that to generate and correlate to the highest possible alarm. You want all the bells and whistles to go off when someone touches in a malicious way that critical business system. So again, get those critical business systems integrated first, get those logging sources integrated first. Again, in my opinion, don't waste your time and effort unless the data is relevant, of course. Practice that IR. Just because that data source answers some questions, does it answer everything you wanted about an event? If I have a successful phish, maybe I don't have enough Office 365 logging, or maybe I have too much logging and it's rolling over. Consider that stuff. Practice these IRs. Go through that tabletop exercise. Understand where you're going to find this data in those log sources that you're retaining. And then, of course, people, process, then technology. Folks, get your people right. Get those processes down, and then let's start integrating that technology. I had to say this the other day. I actually had an insurance company challenge. They were saying, well, geez, you had this incident response and there was a SIM in the environment. Why didn't you do 100% of everything within the SIM? Why did you do host-based forensics? It turns out the SIM wasn't logging the things that they thought it was logging, specifically type 10 logons, authentication. So someone coming in and successfully coming in through a RDP session. SIM didn't even log that, right? That's a major blind spot. The SIM is not a standalone tool for incident response. Relying upon the SIM alone is like driving a car by sound instead of sight. Yeah, you can probably do it, but there's a monumental environmental visibility gap there, which of course will send you headfirst directly into a wall, I promise. So Realworld IR, a tale of two SIMs, folks. Two SIM technologies were in this client environment. We had authentication failures not logged by the SIM. So what do you think happened when this attacker was trying, multiple thousands of times to pop this service account? SIM never saw it. Type 10 logons, those logons over RDP, also not logged in the SIM. What do you think happened when the attacker guessed the right password and successfully logged in via RDP? SIM didn't see it, folks. When the attacker deployed ransomware, that got their attention just a little bit, right? SIM lights up at that point. I get this question all the time. What's my favorite SIM? This is the exact same as my favorite firewall, a properly configured one. Folks, I don't care what you're using for some sort of centralized logging device. I don't care if you have the latest and greatest or that you're using something open source. Get those logs centralized, be able to view that security information and event monitoring. Is the SIM a standalone tool for IR? Probably nope, with a side of nope. If you have a very mature program and everything is going in there and everything is relevant and right, you are the poster child for SIM technology in an enterprise networked environment, then folks, you're probably good, and that SIM's going to help you with IR. But most cases see this over and over and over again, where certain logs that are critical to the investigation aren't being ingested by that SIM, even though that logging device is or that technology is able to log or send a log. So what are you logging? Most companies either don't retain the right logs or retaining too little of the right logs due to default storage configurations. If you turn on more advanced logging, if you kind of get out of default, which I hope each and every one of you listening to this will, get out of those default logging configurations. But understand that you want to make sure there is enough storage for you. Just because you turn on that log that's going to give you all these advanced analytics and give you that source and destination IP of whatever event happens, it doesn't mean that thing's not going to roll every 59 minutes. Are you retaining enough? So recent incident I'm talking about here, we had 338 failed login attempts were noted within an RDP event log file in this operational log. These events occurred within approximately 5-minute time period, and within that 5 minutes of guessing, that filled up the log 100%. So I know that the attacker tried 338 times, but I don't know if the attacker tried 512 times from this particular data source. It's exactly what I'm talking about. So in this case, this log contains wonderful things, but by default, that size likely isn't going to give us enough if we're dealing with an RDP brute force. Understanding artifacts of execution. This is a screenshot from actually a great resource from JP Cert. They did a really good job of just kind of breaking out in a PDF form. It's from 2017, so a little bit old, but this is an example of WMIC, right? So Windows Management Instrumentation Command Line. So when an attacker or someone on a workstation fires up WMIC and does some sort of command to a remote machine, we have the logging artifacts on the host and also on the destination. I love this because it's not a very large PDF, and really everything from PS exec to a successful RDP, it will give you all of those indicators so you can make sure that your logging sources contain this kind of stuff. So are you logging these? What about PowerShell logs, Prefetch, right, on those systems? This is more host-based type stuff, of course. Those security logs, those system logs. What about that web server you have hanging out there, or that distributed hosted web application? Are you logging that stuff? What about DNS? What about those software application logs? Okay, software application logs, usually I'm not going to find something too interesting. But let's think about this scenario. So this is from the PowerShell changelog. Version 6.2, they just came out with a fix for a crash. Basically, if you sent white space to PowerShell, it would just crash, right? So considering something like this, would you be more interested in application logs? Maybe, maybe not. If an attacker is trying to do some binary exploitation and is, knocking over some sort of software in my environment, having that, depending on the asset, having that integrated into my SIM along with other kind of information, that could correlate to something extremely positive that you should look at. Just quick on PowerShell. Basically, I'm sorry about this. As I was writing these slides, I got a question about PowerShell, basically talking about how PowerShell treats everything as an object instead of a string. And I went on about an hour-and-a-half tangent, and I think my wife fell asleep. So this is where the PowerShell slide came from. But it's good stuff, and I think it blends nicely with what Mike's going to talk about in just a little bit. So with PowerShell version 2, logs didn't really provide much relevant data to us. PowerShell is big. It has been when PowerShell first came out. It wasn't too out there. More attack frameworks such as Empire, right? Metasploit has very rich PowerShell support. We're seeing a lot of rich vendor support. Cisco, Dell, VMware, all supporting PowerShell stuff. PowerShell's kind of taken over. But really, we kind of look here at what kind of logging we have. So in PowerShell version 3, we introduced module logging. So any modules that we're firing off, we can get some logs around that. PowerShell version 5 really was the most notable, in my opinion, advancement in logging here. We introduced the script block logging, which is incredibly painful for an attacker. As we said, we want to cause pain to that attacker, and pure gold for the defender. It can deobfuscate PowerShell code, and then script block logging, you want to enable that either through registry or a group policy object. When you're messing with group policy, make sure you test it first. You don't want any rolling black screens or mess anything up. PowerShell version 6, it's no longer PowerShell.exe. So PowerShell version 6 is running on Netcore 2.0, and it runs as pwsh.exe. Any of you defenders out there, do you have detection rules around pwsh.exe firing on a system that you might have PowerShell.exe detection logs around or something like that? Ugh. So PowerShell version 6 plus and then 7 that's going to be coming out runs as that pwsh.exe, continues to enhance that cross-platform functionality. The world's crazy right now, right? We have PowerShell running on Mac and Linux. We have Bash running on Windows. It's crazy. On Mac and Linux, If you're running PowerShell in that environment, logging's configured using the PowerShell config JSON file, so you can kind of toggle things there. Of note, whereas PowerShell on Windows is using the Windows event forwarding, on Linux, PowerShell logs to syslog, so you need to be ingesting that, of course. And then on Mac OS, it's using the Apple OS log system. Interesting, if you're running any PowerShell on these cross platforms, you may have some visibility gaps that you want to look at. PowerShell version 6.2, just to call this out, now we can build PowerShell natively on Kali, right? So all of those red teams, all of those penetration testers, no longer do we have a Windows box that we have to bring to the party. We can natively interact with PowerShell inside those environments natively on Kali Linux, if that's what you're using for testing. My point there is PowerShell on Kali provides a common and functional interaction point for attackers. So be looking out. So Prefetch, what is it? Well, it speeds up the launch of Windows client applications by optimizing that startup I/O. So any specific things I need for that application to fire, I want to have that in a Prefetch file so that the system can load that application quicker and more efficiently for me. As an attacker, this is bad because if I execute any EXEs on that host system, if a Prefetch file is generated, you'll be able to tell, okay, this is when the attacker executed payload.exe, and then here's some other information about that malicious payload. So basically here, if the prefetch.pf file exists, a kernel component of the prefetcher issues an asynchronous I/O to prefetch metadata, blah blah blah. Basically, information from that prefetch file helps the computer efficiently load that application. But in the case of an attacker firing some sort of script from PowerShell.exe or PWSH, if that prefetch file is generated, it will include information about that executed PowerShell script. DNS logs, great to have in the limited cases where I have these. Most organizations retaining far too little. They'll say, yep, we have DNS logs, but they are a few minutes just because they are not retaining enough of them due to disk space issues, or they're just rolling far too quickly. Like many other data sources, tons and tons of value here. DNS logs are valuable for all kinds of follow-on analytics and environmental network tuning. And it also helps you get an idea of what good looks like and identify any malicious domains, right? If I see something, a known malicious domain beaconing out, it's very easy to script something up, kind of looking through these DNS logs and then firing an alert if I'm not just natively ingesting these DNS logs into some other centralized solution. Weblogs, monitor them weblogs, folks. Most organizations, again, retain far too little. I can't count how many times I've heard weblogs aren't feeding into our SIM. All right, if you have a SIM, make sure those weblogs are there. As I said, this is usually edge type stuff. These are usually where the crown jewels are sometimes, depending on your organization. So most web application logs, they're just difficult for an attacker to clean or clear. If I am poking at a web application, I know that I'm logging. I know that I'm logging on that thing. If you're not ingesting those web logs into your SIM, guess what, folks? You're not seeing me poke at that. You're not seeing me do that initial reconnaissance before I try some other kind of attack vector inside your network. So it's a valuable data source for uncovering that attacker recon. Monitoring process creation, just like we talked about just a little bit ago. Event ID 4688, we can activate this by enabling audit process creation for success. So basically, every time an EXE loads as a new process, it's going to generate this security log event. That can definitely generate a lot of logging, but think about doing this in a very strategic and tailored way. If I had this kind of event logging happening on my endpoints and all of that feeding into a centralized location, I'd be able to quickly start baselining what applications are running in my environment. When that hackerbadvirus.exe executes on Jane and Finance's desktop computer, it'd be something that I can write detection rules and flag around. So just something for you to consider, and then also maybe helping to develop any application whitelisting initiatives in your network. So it's just a quick screenshot. This is from Microsoft.com, of course. So this is Microsoft's minimum recommended audit policy as far as a host goes, right? So account login, success and failures, all of that. This next slide, I kind of went through and said, okay, of these 30 things that Microsoft's saying you definitely want to log, Things in green here, and again, I apologize for the colors, but the things in green here, I definitely want these. Account log on, success and failure, yes, must have. Things like security state change, sensitive privilege use, MPS service rule level policy change, that would be an attacker changing a firewall rule or popping a new port through that host-based firewall. Of course, I want that stuff. Other things here, if I'm like, you know what, I don't have the space and I don't have the time to ingest and store and monitor all of these logs, IPsec extended mode, quick mode, maybe that's not valuable to me in my environment. File system changes, maybe every file that's accessed not so valuable. Also think on the flip side, maybe file access to a specific folder or sensitive file location on my domain controllers or something like that. Maybe I want to log that. So just something to think about. In general, folks, default configurations, they're just bad. Make sure you have that data available when there comes a time to quickly and effectively respond to that incident. Network logging. I wish everyone could do full take packet capture at the edge and retain for 90 days, but I guess I'm a realist. If you can't do this, right, like most of us, consider a passive sensor that can be enabled as needed. You have something scary that's happening in the environment, you pop some weird alerts on your SIM. Maybe you want to have something that you can just kind of flip on and it does full take packet capture even in a limited amount of time. NetFlow's great, but beware of network perspectives. We see a lot of complications sometimes with different load balancing, and sometimes it's really hard to tell where that traffic was originating from. Yes, it made it internal, but it bounced around through all these different devices on the way to get to that internal network. So be aware of those network perspectives. And then understand your network, right? And then decide that best plan of execution. And as I said here, Mike from CI Security says it best: when investigating an event, you never want to discover that you're ignoring an important source. Folks, that's a bad feeling. That's one of those sinking feelings. You don't want to have that. So in closing here, before I turn it over to Mike to go through his presentation, which hopefully you'll get a lot of enjoyment out of, I know I will. Default logging, pretty much always bad. Don't be that data glutton. In most cases, you're already trying to find that needle in a haystack. Why add more hay, right? Rank data sources according to identified criticalities and noted visibility gaps. That data source must be relevant. Haven't said that yet, have I? And then in closing, information security, it's an iterative process. Learn to dance in the rain. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mike. Thank you.
Thank you, Brandon. And I have to sort of interject here. One of the most important things you had to say, I think, in all of this was essentially that you do have to prioritize. And we're gonna launch here into a little bit of how to have the conversation with the rest of your network team, with the rest of your organization about what you collect and why you do so. I'm also going to poke a little bit of fun at you by saying that you simultaneously said, "Oh yeah, don't collect all the things." That's the wrong attitude, and then you named all the things. So, and truly, what happened there was he didn't name all the things. There are so many data sources that are available to a modern network or modern network administrator or security team that that seemingly somewhat exhaustive list that Brandon went through is actually scratching the surface. And what I'm going to do here quickly is walk through how to categorize those things in a way that lends itself to great conversations about why you're collecting something and what you expect to be able to do with it. Your data collection and your use of that and your incident response has to all be purposeful. So let's dive into that just a little bit. One of my great actual not quotes is this one from Willy Sutton. If you're not familiar with Willy, he was a bank robber that evaded, I believe, the FBI for nearly 40 years. Gained some notoriety, had a couple of big books written supposedly by or with him. Why do you rob banks? Well, because that's where the money is. Why do we look at logs? Why are we talking about the things we're talking about today? It's because that's where the evidence of what's happening on your network is. These are the sources of truth regarding what's happening on your network. And if you roll all of those things up into the most important, the most clear source of truth, Brandon talked a bit about packet capture. Packet capture is truth. Whatever happened in a packet capture happened on your network. We saw it, it went past us. Those bits are true, but it's extraordinarily voluminous. Brandon mentioned, I think, a couple of times that he'd love to be able to capture 90 days of packet capture for the edge of most networks. The solution that CI puts in place, we capture 14 days. That's our baseline guarantee. If we have more space than that on a collector, we collect more. But for the very reason that Brandon pointed out, among all of the things happening, that packet capture is complete. It is a complete view of what happened at the point of capture. Let's see. Oops. Some quick disclaimers. We talk a lot about logs and events and data and things like NetFlow. NetFlow is actually a structured data source. It arrives from the network, not truly as a log. If we wanted to have a half-hour gunfight regarding what we really should call all these things, that's enjoyable and for a different podcast or a different cast. I'm going to refer to all of these things pretty typically as logs. They are that atomic thing that you can collect from a data source that tells you something about what's going on. So you've got all of those things that Brandon mentioned. You've got network devices, endpoint servers, and stuff that generate a ton of information. If you're wondering about how big that ton of information is, turn on all the logging from all your stuff and centralize it and see how fast your disk goes away. Packet capture, again, is the most voluminous of these. On an average week, we're looking at a little bit over 2 petabytes of packet capture, just in general, and extracting artifacts from that packet capture. Logs, on the other hand, don't take up all that space, not all that much space, especially as you compress them for archive and so on. And I'll talk a little bit about what that looks like a little later on. Properly analyzed, though, you get useful data. Unfortunately, if you collect all the things, there's too much of it, and by volume, most of it's useless. Of all of the things that your system is logging, all of the things that you might collect, the greater bulk of it is actually not useful in terms of analysis for information security, for events and information security. And I don't know about you, but I don't have infinite time storage or patience to look through everything. So Brandon had a pretty good slide regarding this. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on it. In general, what you're trying to do with all the information you're collecting has a lot of different dimensions. You want to track operational attributes. How is your network doing? Are you running out of disk space? All kinds of stuff that your systems are telling you about. You are trying to meet regulatory requirements. Depending on what regulatory environment you're living in, healthcare is one of the most interesting ones in terms of the fact that HIPAA has been around for quite a long time, has a lot of prescriptive things about what you'll collect and what you'll keep track of, and so on and so forth. My other favorite actually is the North American Electric Reliability Council SIP requirements for electric utilities. Very prescriptive. You will keep the following things. There is some overlap between those regulatory required things and security monitoring, but it's not 100%. You're also, in a lot of cases, creating a forensic record. So for example, while watching file system changes on an endpoint can be interesting, and in fact is extremely interesting when a ransomware event occurs. You start to see after the fact what the extent of that attack was, what they were trying for first, potentially even detecting it early stages using that kind of monitoring. 99.99999 some extraordinary number of 9% of the time, it's your users accessing files. So forensically, very, very useful in that case, detectively, occasionally useful. And then monitoring for security threats, kind of the focus of what we're talking about now. Those operational, when you're having this conversation with your ops team, if you're in information security yourself, when you're having this conversation with the ops team and they say, yeah, I really want to know the uptime on the firewall. You know, we want to keep track of that. Yes, they need to know that. And if you give Brandon, I think, or myself, any bit of information, I can tell you how it could be used to monitor security situations on your network. I'll diverge briefly for a short story here on the CPU load on a firewall was once used to exfiltrate data via ping timing from the outside. It was an unusual circumstance, a very high profile target. That firewall CPU load was actually being modulated such that the ping times were modulated such that you could actually, through literally in this case Morse code, send data from the inside to the outside with actually not sending any real data from the inside to the outside. So yes, operational data can and is used as security monitoring. For the most part, though, you want to focus on those things that you can most directly attribute to attack. Regulatory requirements. If you're within a regulatory environment, you must do these things or you have the potential of being fined. One of my other favorite things about NERC SIP requirements is that their fining authority is, I believe, still $1 million per day per incident backdated to whoever you started screwing up. That particular regulation, people pay a fair amount of attention to. I think it goes back to the, why aren't you turning off your NT40 boxes from Brandon's talk? You don't turn those boxes off if they're each generating $1 million a day. You make sure you meet your regulatory requirements because they might cost you $1 million per day. So it usually comes with a very prescriptive list and overlaps with operational and security as well. So the last category here, outage and failure and exception logs. When things break, when things aren't working, when your monitoring of them shows that they're either degrading or completely unacceptable or unavailable. There's a greater overlap in some cases with that with security. So for example, when things start going offline, that could be because from an IT perspective, they broke, or it could be through an attack, either a denial of service attack of some sort, or through another kind of degradation of that service by an attacker. So there's a fair amount of overlap there. There's a tremendous amount of overlap with forensic capture for failures and exceptions. Again, for ransomware, as things start to fail, you want as much detail about how and why after the fact to be able to figure out what that attack vector was, to be able to figure out how you might have prevented it, and in the context of this discussion, to figure out what you should have been monitoring to tell you about it as early as possible. So the temptation is to just start with a list of stuff and then and justify that the existence of your list and say, here's just this big uncategorized pile. If you start with categories and talk about why do I want this? What will it do for me? And that's actually what we're going to walk through in the rest of this presentation is that why bit. You have a much better conversation actually with those people that you're interacting with in the organization. You're able to say, I need this, and need is an important aspect here. I need this in order to see when an attacker is performing a password spray, for example. Of all of the types of sources that Brandon mentioned in his presentation, you heard login come up time and time again. And it's not because Brandon has a particular affinity for login. It's because it's one of the most important, if not the most important sources that you can use to understand what's going on from a security perspective in your network. If you're a Windows shop, there's some very specific aspects of Windows loggings that will give you that. But one of the reasons to categorize is to be able to also say, well, I also want these TACACS login streams from my network infrastructure. I also want Radius from, let's say, some of my edge devices. Those are also login streams, also critically important to understanding attacks against that infrastructure. So why are we going to go down this path? Well, one of the things I always suggest to people is if somebody has a framework that you can use for this kind of categorization, use it. There's a few out there. Inventing your own means you'll have to maintain a framework and try to keep track. Basically, if you're not a security professional whose job it is to maintain one of these frameworks, don't do it. Pick an attack categorization framework, because what we're really trying to look for here is evidence of attacks. In some cases, evidence of the successful attack and the subsequent actions on that attack. But an attack framework works really well. Actually, when Brandon was raised as the co-presenter by SANS for this presentation, I was really overjoyed to see what his background was. When I'm having these conversations, either internally for my company as we build out detection systems, or with customers or consulting clients in the field, that attack scenario, that red team view of things, is one of the most important, interesting conversations you can have with respect to, hey, Brandon, what terrifies you in terms of monitoring? What is the thing that you least want that target to be doing? Because that's what I want to focus on first. So you want the high level stuff of things to be looking for from that framework. You want a lot of detail about what that looks like when you see it. So what does a login failure look like? Well, the characteristics of a login failure are usually, there's a source that initiated it. There is an account that was attempted to be logged into. There was a destination, the host the host or system that was attempted to be logged into. But between domain controller logs, Radius, and TACACS, the formats are all different. And that, again, is why you do this high-level categorization. So you can kind of say, I don't care what the format is of the source. I just know I want lots of login stuff. So we can move on a little bit. There are lots of possibilities for the frameworks you could choose. Lockheed Martin, years and years ago, came out with a very useful tool called the intrusion kill chain, or often referred to as the cyber kill chain. That is essentially a mechanism for describing those things that must happen for an intrusion to be successful. The idea that if you can interrupt certain aspects of that kill chain or kill a piece of that chain, the attack itself will be unsuccessful. Starting with reconnaissance, where people are trying, or the attackers are trying to figure out what resources to attack, what you have, what your edge looks like, how to get in through that edge, and so on and so forth. MITRE's adversarial tactics, techniques, and common knowledge, the attack framework, spelled correctly there with the ampersand, is the one I tend to use internally. It's modern, it's complete. I'll show you a quick screenshot of how complete it is, I think on the next slide. Point being, pick one that makes sense to you. Pick one that works and that you understand, and use that. Use it internally consistently, and I think almost anything published is going to be useful for you in this case. The last one is actually one I've not used, the Cybersecurity Academy's combination of the kill chain and the attack framework. Sounds interesting. I've never found a need to actually use those as a combined resource. Okay, that's that worse than eye chart view at the bottom is the complete list of essentially all of the super categories in the attack framework. As long as you all have the next 16 hours to walk through this, we'll go through each and every one of them. I'm looking at the clock though and thinking maybe we don't have that much time. So we won't. What I will do is talk a little bit about the highest levels of each of these categories. I'm going to blow past this. This is a representation of these highest levels. What I will do is dive into examples of using categorization with this tactics list from the attack framework and how that applies to you and how you might be able to justify and explain how you would use a data source with this frame. So probably the easiest thing to do is start looking at the physical sources that you have, domain controller logs, endpoint security logs from your desktops, if you have some level of endpoint security on desktops, your firewall logs, your NetFlow, and so on. And then looking at the attack framework, say, if I had my domain controller logs, and by the way, this is not exhaustive, I'm giving examples here, you would probably have a lot more in each of these categories. If I had my domain controller logs, what would I see in those domain controller logs with respect to the attack framework tactics list? Well, pretty obviously you would see attempts or success at initial access. You would see very likely privilege escalation, depending on how it's accomplished. If it's accomplished through an operating system bug that doesn't actually create a login event, you wouldn't. If it's a login event because of an operating system bug, you would see that. And again, I'm not going to exhaustively walk through this slide, but from firewall logs, again, initial access, but more interestingly, from a firewall, you would at least forensically and hopefully detectively see exfiltration. You would see the event where an attacker who has gained a foothold started moving data through your perimeter to a third party. So you get the idea of how you can take that attack framework and categorize physical sources here. There's another level of abstraction that I like to walk through that allows for almost management level discussions of this, so that you're not talking about something that kind of makes your fellow managers' eyes glaze over. In terms of domain controller logs, you're talking about access control as a topic. So within access control, if you hand me access control logs, not too surprisingly, I see the same things as I would in the domain controller logs, because what do domain controllers do? They, among other things, control access. So this gives you another sort of abstraction type to use in terms of categorizing the various data sources you might have. A little bit more of the same, where we talk about, at the highest level for security analysis, as opposed to operations, as opposed to, just doing monitoring of uptime and availability, network capabilities, and so on. For security analysis, a quick cut on the high-level abstractions are endpoint security, access control, network device security, or network device information in the form of flow logs or ACL violations, and security controls themselves, firewalls, intrusion detection systems, and so on. If we were to break down a little bit on the endpoint bits here, you start to see the actual output of this abstraction categorization process. So in endpoint security, there are more categories than I have listed here, but let's say AV, UEBA, and host intrusion detection systems. Under AV, you may have one or more of these actual sources, and not all of them are the same. Then they don't even produce exactly the same kinds of information, but from an attack tactics perspective, they may actually give you the same view, the same kind of information that you can then use in a rule to detect an event happening at that level. So what we're arming you here with is the answers to why this source. If in fact I can get this source and I can record it, and I can record it for some period of time, which is important to me, what am I going to do with it? I think if you can't answer the why or the what, as Brandon alluded to earlier, and actually one of the quotes that I cannot verbatim get in my own head one of the quotes Brandon used earlier was, if you're collecting a thing and you are not able to watch it or use it, in some ways that's actually worse. You might have a false sense of security, and there's actually other issues with, well, you had this evidence in front of you and yet this harm occurred. You can actually incur some liability in that case. So disk space is relatively cheap. Compressed logs, not packet capture, but logs are pretty tiny. And from a forensic standpoint, it makes sense to collect more. From a detection standpoint, you need to have a reason. You have to have a specific detection-based reason for collecting, subjecting that thing to an analysis, and then actions that are implied based on your analysis and what you detected. And sorry for the pause. I'm trying to get the computer systems to cooperate. There we go. My coworkers, of course, will be familiar with this. Gives us the ability to say, no, I don't need that. I can't use it. Maybe somebody else can use it, and that's great for them, but I don't need it myself. So, and the nope is goal-based. It's not, oh, that's a silly data source, why did you even bring it up? It's none of us can figure out how this would tell us about an attacker in our network. If you can come back to me with how this would explain that to me, I'm happy to use this data source. And again, I'll reiterate, the best conversation I have about this particular topic is with our in-house red team and really any red team that is actually creating the artifacts kindly for me. So what to do with this? Inventory everything you might get. Pick the adversary model like we explained. Select those high-level abstractions so that you can actually have the conversation internally with stakeholders and with management so that they actually understand what you're trying to accomplish here and why, for example, you're asking your network or systems team to give you these data sources. Because the converse conversation is also true. The conversation about, hey, if you don't give me this, I cannot possibly detect the following list of attack vectors. Also a very interesting and useful conversation to have. Walk through that inventory, do the classification, and walk through your classified buckets with the adversary model, tagging things with that source. I guarantee if you walk through these steps, that list that you end up with is something that a company like what Brandon works for that does red teaming, anybody that's doing a penetration test, anybody that's doing detection on your systems can have a really interesting conversation with you about why, what it is that you might be missing. Hey, do you have this source? Because I don't see it in your categorized list. And here's kind of some of those bits about how you might approach this. If you have an enterprise SIEM, take a look at the rule set and what you just created from that last slide. Make sure the SIEM is applying correlative and detective rules against the data as you expect. So is the SIEM in its rule set able to actually do the things that you expected from the attack framework classification? If the answer is no, you've got some digging to do. If you are rolling your own, same thing applies, except it's all on you. And if you have a managed service, like what CI provides, that's the conversation to have with us. Here are the sources I'm providing you. What are you able to do with those sources? Are there gaps? I'm not really good at dumping reams of information on folks, and this wasn't intended to be that. This was intended to be structure around the conversation. So I'll walk through this really quickly. High-level sources ranked, not surprisingly, access control data at the top, security control data from firewalls, WAFs, IDSs, endpoint data from those various UEBA, AV systems, and so on. Correlative streams, and actually I would include in correlative streams, Brandon talked a little bit about open source. One of the things that I love to see, and we do ourselves, is take open source information, and then as we see an event, as we see something in the data stream that is related to that event, either by source, by URL, by IP, subnet, or so on and so forth. If there's anything in that open source intel that I can correlate to an event stream, I like to be able to put those in front of analysts so that they can make better decisions. And then network content data, obviously, the network-based AV, ACLs, reputation hits, and so on. And then device data, primarily for forensic purposes in terms of network streams. And then I think the final kind of dump screen of this, of the lists, what would be on those lists? Your domain controller logs, VPN logs, firewalls, switches, databases, and IDS and HIDs. These are, by the way, both of these screens, this one and this one, are ranked, at least in my opinion, in terms of level of importance. And then, of course, in this screen, you also have the attack framework classification for each of these source types. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because I know we're out of time, but let's see. Yeah, I think each of you will get this deck, or at least have seen this deck. You can read this one yourself. With that, I'll conclude and hand it back to Carol.
All right, well, as you said, we are unfortunately out of time. Questions that have been submitted, Mike, I'll be sure that you guys receive so you can respond. But also any questions not answered during this webcast can be submitted to q@sans.org. Thank you so much, Mike and Brandon, for your great presentation, and to CI Security for sponsoring this webcast, which helps bring this content to the SANS community. To our audience, we greatly appreciate you listening in. For our schedule of all upcoming and archived SANS webcasts, including this one, please visit sans.org/webcasts. Until next time, take care, and we hope to have you back again for the next SANS webcast.